Welcome back to Beyond the Arts. I'm Joe Williams. Today we're diving into the electrifying conversation with an artist whose work is powerful, personal, and deeply layered, Michel Dumont. Michel is a queer, Métis, two-spirited artist from Thunder Bay, Ontario, whose work spans mosaic, wearable art, and installation, all infused with themes of resilience, identity, and decolonization. Michel, welcome to the show.
Bonjour. Indigena cause Michel Dumont, Makwa Dodem. Hello, my name is Michel Dumont, and I am of the Bear Clan. It is, wonderful to, finally get to meet you guys. I've become a fan, and I'm following your whole playlist.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Whenever someone says that they follow the podcast and they listen, I instantly become nervous because I'm like, oh, geez, you're hearing everything then. So I feel like a spotlight on me. So, so your work has been described as breathing new life into discarded materials. I love that idea. How do you first get into working with vintage tile and mosaics?
Oh my. Okay. So I guess when I moved to Thunder Bay, about 36 years ago now, one of my first jobs was at the Lakehead Psychiatric Hospital as a security guard. And so they have these beautiful terrazzo floors that were put in by Italians in our city in the 1950s, the 1940s, etc. And so I fell in love with mosaic, and I fell in love with these terrazzo floors working at the psychiatric hospital. And so, people ask me, well, why are you into discarded ceramics? Well, partially because of poverty. I hurt my back when I was about 29. And I remember seeing all these beautiful sample boards behind a bath and tile store on one of the bad parts of town. And in the alley, they were just leaning up, ready for, the bin. And they were stunning and so pretty. And I had always loved mosaic. So, there I was, with a bad back, mind you, carrying all these boards onto the city bus. I just had enough bus fare to get home. And so there I am, with 20 boards or so, making it home, killing my back. But then that started this love affair about, 20 some odd years ago of, reclaiming something that would have been just, thrown into the skiff, right? And rescuing it and seeing something beautiful out of something that would have been just discarded. It just seemed a shame.
You've also created incredible wearable arts using packing tape, cellophane, and LED lights. How did that artistic exploration begin?
Okay, so I'm going to start off with a childhood memory of a simpler time in the 70s. And I remember these little cardboard, pastry boxes, because we didn't have the clear plastic ones that we now are ubiquitous throughout the land, right? And they had this little cellophane window that you could peer inside and see the pastries on the inside. And I, as a child, that little magic window was like a kaleidoscope of like confectionery treats, right? I would rip the cellophane window off the cardboard greasy package. I would lick the icing off of it, right? And I would play with that little square of cellophane, right? And suck every bit of sugar off of it as possible. And so, I know it's a lightweight material, and really, I'm a Halloween guy. I've always been a Halloween guy, but then, my mother, dressed me up in drag when I was like 6 years old with a wig, and, she was so proud of her, little girl. And so, having, Halloween sort of, big in Indigenous communities, and then, learning about, packing tape and cellophane that, you could shoot light through it and like as a Halloween decoration. And so it was, the next step was, for me was making garments out of it and making like a sort of a artificial leather out of the material. And once you create, this artificial leather, all of a sudden you have a myriad of options opened up to you. And so I was, starting to make, wearable pieces of art, like a mylar black jacket with, see-through chrome studs, but made out of packing tape, and then you could put an LED strip through it and have it glow. And so that was one of my first, wearable art pieces, along with my amethyst crystal dress. And so I'm making, something lightweight, something that's easily, found at a dollar store, packing tape and cellophane, for that shot of color. I remember when I realized that packing or cellophane came in colors. I felt so stupid. I'm like, and then I started going to craft stores, and I'm like, geez, maybe I don't have to go for, flower, gift wrap that's all see-through. I could actually get colors. And so, yeah, I've taught myself each stage of the way, each way, of how to play with the medium and get better at it. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So much of your work touches on your experiences as a trauma survivor and two-spirit identity. How does your art serve as a form of healing or resistance for you?
Ooh. So discussing intersectionality was something that happened pretty early on in my career. One of my first art shows, or my second art show in Toronto, was the Queer Landscape show, and I started getting exposed to the contemporary art world through my queer intersection. And so I was sitting there with a docent or the director who was, teaching the docents, because I was only in town for a brief couple of days. And so I wanted to see how the gallery ran. And there were, 6 or 7, voluntary docents who were, the gallerist was explaining intersectionality, how this queer Filipino, artist, and giving, explaining intersectionality to me. And, I just sort of burst at the seams. I'm disabled, I'm Métis, I'm queer, and so I'm like, I have a lot of intersections. And, then I realized that, and she had explained to me that, gay people had wanted to collect queer art and that they were starting to. And so that led me on to, realizing that my intersections were finally being celebrated. And earlier on, when I tried taking visual arts in my, when I was 19 or 20, I was told, don't tell people you're gay. Don't tell people you're Indian. It will only marginalize your work, and your work should stand on its own. Well, with advice like that, I didn't make artwork for a good 15 years. Really, being told that I couldn't be myself, that was, well, what does the art world have for me, right? And so, I made art with, my friends, friends' kids, or we make candles. I made candles that, got taken around the world, actually. I just had fun, working at Old Fort William and, as a native interpreter. And it was funny, I wasn't quite indigenous enough for the native encampment. I was told I had to be a voyageur, and with this French, my French father's face and my, my ethnic background, it was like, okay, I'll be a voyageur, fine. But I just want to be an Indian at the Indian encampment, learning Ojibwe with all my, and of course the women who were there spoke fluent Ojibwe, and I spent every, lunch break, aniing and joking with the ladies, right, who were really, they were laughing at my accent, how bad it was. And I'm like, I know it's bad. But these are half remembered words of my mother's tongue, right? And the thing is, my mother spoke French, Ojibwe, and English. And sadly, because of her experience at Indian day school, she beat English into my sister and I. And I had to read dictionaries. We were forced to read the Oxford Dictionary or the Bible. And my sister and I would take turns every night. And I think I had read 5 dictionaries by the time I was 12. And I had read the Bible back and forth from, 4 times by the time I was 12. And there are big words in both, right? And the thing is, it was for the school system, the Indian day school system, that, made her so worried that, we would sound Indian like she did, that we would have her accent. And of course, I guess we were listening to, her accent and she was so alarmed. She wanted us, to act white and sound white. And sadly, that lesson has come to help me, especially when I'm in a hospital, hoping for care. But that her experience at the Indian day school in Nipigon was something that I was raised with. Sort of, I guess you could call me a second generation, survivor of an Indian day school. I think that's the appropriate way of, terming it. And so I took her 1955 classroom photo to Banff with me. And I took it first to art residency, the intergenerational gay and lesbian art residency in Toronto with Tabarin Waxman. I met up with Cyrus Marcus Ware, professor, trans professor at Hamilton. Oh, God. And so I showed them my mother's classroom photo from 1950. It's black and white. It's a one-room schoolroom. And I explained, all my aunties and my uncle are in this classroom photo, and I wanted to make some artwork. And they said to me during the studio visit, which is why residencies are so important, they said, you know how rare this material is, this archival material? And I said, kind of. Like, I know my mother got a job as a tree planter so she could afford those photographs in the 1970s. And the photographer was a well-known photographer in the Lake Nipigon area who photographed Indigenous peoples from like the 1930s till the 1950s or so. And he charged her like $300 for like 5 photos. And so that was highway robbery then, and it's still eye-popping now. And my mother complained for years, but she got a job, as a tree planter because, my dad allowed her to work. But this is the 1970s. Like, if he said, if you want to buy a car, get a job, and, you can save up your money for a car. So my mom got her driver's license at the age of 29, and she bought these family photos. And even as a young child, I realized, that I would ask, well, why are they not smiling? And my mother would say, well, you couldn't smile for a camera. Well, we know that's not true now. And then I would ask, well, why is their hair all cut short? And she would say, oh, that was the style at the time. But see, even in the 1970s, as a young child, I realized there was a difference between her classroom photos and mine. And so because the Indian day school settlement was, before the courts and I was aware of it, actually I had a reporter, ask me in 2016 about, I took part in this. I know I'm going to digress. So I took part in this call to, Christmas traditions that were Indigenous by the CBC. And so I'm like, oh, I make moose meat tourtière. And I've been doing this since I was a young one with my Nokmas and my mother, right? And so that recipe and my photographs of my pie all of a sudden had like 2,500 shares on Facebook, and it was Christmas Day, and I'm like, people actually care about my family traditions. Holy moly, that is so cool. But at the same time, that reporter asked me, if my grandmother or my mother had went to residential school. And I said, oh no, like, I don't know about my grandmother, but my mother went to Indian day school. And that set me on an education path because I had heard about the residential school system. I just didn't equate them to the same. And even though I had the evidence that I was growing up with, in our family photo albums, I still put me on a journey to learn that the same, techniques of assimilation and abuse, were in both school systems. And, when I started thinking about, the trauma that my sister and I, survived, I had to understand, where the root cause was and lay it directly at its feet. And sadly, here I am, I go to Banff and I realize I'm at a magic mountain of art making, that it's a dream factory. And so my first artist talk second artist talk I ever did, I'm in a theater of my peers. And at the last minute, I throw this photo, I find it on my phone, and like a frantic several hour search. And then I put it up on this big screen and I start talking about it, that I want to, incorporate this into a piece of artwork. And I started to cry, and there was not a dry eye in the house when I explained that. The shock of seeing it 20 feet by 20 feet on a theater wall, the impact that when people see it. And so here I am. I decide that, I'm inspired by Rebecca Belmore and her performance of Vigil. And I recently got to talk to Rebecca just like last week. She was doing an artist talk at the Thunder Bay Art Gallery. And the thing is, Rebecca is one of the preeminent Ojibwe artists of our time. And I've been fortunate enough to invite her into my home and show her my artwork and tell her how meaningful her practice is and how it's made me a better artist. And so, inspired by that, I decided, and a disability arts gallery in Toronto, Tangled, allowed me to read out the names of the students in the classroom and break the ceramic tile with the image of the classroom on it. And then, during the pandemic, I was able to use the Japanese art form of kintsugi to, show the beauty in the broken and not hide the history. And because my mother had tried to hide that history, because it was painful. And, even though she tried to have rose-colored glasses, I was able to see through that. And so here I am, during the pandemic, I finally had time to, put it together. And it did show briefly for a few months, the summer before Kamloops. And I was told that, by the curators at Definitely Superior Art Gallery, that unless you had a cultural connection to the photo, you saw a quaint black and white photo of a one-room schoolhouse and you just moved on. But if you were culturally connected to the photo, they knew exactly what I was saying and what I was doing. And sadly, it took a tragedy of the discovery of 215 graves at Kamloops Residential School in BC for the rest of the country to know exactly what I was trying to say. And it went viral. Like, it had, 1,000 or so shares. It was humbling to finally be recognized for a message that was easily unnoticed. And I feel really saddened that it took a national tragedy for people to understand, my history. I'm going to cry.
Yeah, I mean, the scale of that, of just that incident, doesn't even touch on all the others that have happened, and it is heartbreaking that in order for people to really connect with us, they have to be aware of these awful things that we all knew happened, but it doesn't seem like they can take our word for it, right? They have to verify these things to be able to connect with us, and that's another aspect to some of this too.
What's so upsetting is the residential school deniers, right? Not every school has a graveyard. That's fantastic, isn't it? I'm very grateful not every schoolyard has a graveyard. However, it still happened. And the thing is, and we have to remember. And the thing is, with my sort of, my embrace of the light with LED lights and with the kintsugi in that, particular artwork, showing the light. I think you can't have one without the other. You need to have the dark, and to acknowledge that it exists, to be able to play in the light. And I think people understand that that's what I'm doing, that I'm really just having queer, joy and queer magic, when I'm like photographing drag queens in my mirror room. And it's funny, like my mirror room is sort of like a drag queen trap, like a demon trap. You make a room of mirrors with pretty lights and drag queens will flock to it. If they fly to the city, they usually end up in my drag queen trap.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. So, so representation is a huge conversation right now. And how do you see Two-Spirit and Indigenous queer identities evolving in the contemporary art world?
Oh my! I remember a few years ago listening to Theo Cuthand talk about, um, indigiqueer. And okay, so now the thing is, when I was a young man, I was an angry punk. I had a lot of things to be angry about. I was angry about racism. I was angry about, colorism. I was angry about homophobia. I had a lot of things to be angry about, right? And so I gravitated to this angry, skinhead punk aesthetic, that I lived in a band house with all the punk bands living, going across the country. They would stay off in Thunder Bay and they would stay in our house. There's a documentary about my misspent youth out there. But it's really about the bar owner. But I had the band house, right, with a bunch of other punks when I was like 21. And so when I heard about, indigiqueer and like indigenous, futurism, stuff like that, it all resonates. And when I, listen to, indige, rap and, I think about the extension of a marginalized communities and BIPOC, I just go, oh my God, there's like words, I needed, to know the term intergenerational trauma when I was like 21 in university in like 1980, 87, 86, right? I needed to know these terms. I mean, I took a lot of psychology and I had a lot of therapy to try to understand, what was up with my family. Right. And it's been a lifelong, journey. And I can't help but think, and I'm wearing, a t-shirt that has signatures of all the youth that, they are learning about, the residential school system and the Indian day school system. I'm part of a course curriculum at my son's, French school. And so the kids, I did a video and then they made a piece of artwork for me that's, a mosaic with gold, kintsugi paint around. It's actually quite beautiful. And so I'm wearing, all the kids' names from two classes, grade 7 and 8. And realistically, speaking, it's giving a vocabulary, to the youth and seeing what they're doing with it. Non-binary, two-spirit, trans folks, love them. I was there in 86, and I was a phone line counselor with the gays and lesbians of Thunder Bay, right? And so I was 19, and here I am. Because I'm out. I was out for like 6 months, and then all of a sudden, I was asked, oh, you're a happy, sort of positive fellow. Why don't you, work the phone line as a peer phone line counselor? And so I did. And I did that for several years. And so I was an activist partially because, I had to do something. Like I had friends who were dying of HIV and AIDS, and going to school didn't necessarily seem to be a place for me. It was extremely homophobic, right? It's one of the reasons why I never finished my degree at LU, and so I spent time being an activist and being sent to I was the graphics editor of our student university newspaper at LU. I went to school for 7 years. Passing never didn't necessarily was the goal. The goal for me was education and meeting people and learning about other people and the activism that I was doing. Like I was, working for Canadian University Press and the Canadian Federation of Students in the early 80s. And I remember, being in these conferences in Ottawa, Toronto, and I'd be smoking away, and these, wonderful kids, you still smoke? And I'm like, doesn't everybody? I'm from Thunder Bay. And I'm like, geez, doesn't everybody still smoke? And so, yeah, I mean, I got to meet other kids, and I got to meet, ACT UP, queer nation people, right? And so, because I was a bit of an ACT UP clone in my early 20s, helping starting the groups here in town, to try to, have consciousness raising, right? Sorry, I can just go on and on. You're going to have to stop me.
Well, okay. So yeah, your work does challenge the colonial narratives and celebrates urban indigenous identity. So what does it mean to you to create work that exists both in traditional and modern terms?
Okay. So that is, kind of a loaded, kind of idea. And I've written about it though, like in Canadian Art Magazine about,
Mhm.
indigeneity and tokenism, et cetera. Right. And so the thing is, gatekeeping and what, we have this perceived, image of what indigeneity must mean. And we should know our references. We should know about beading. We should know about, regalia wear. The fact that I just translate it into a different medium, like, carved ceramic tile, it's just because I have nerve damage from my back injury and I can still work a power tool, right? And so the thing is translating, and hearkening to indigeneity, that we have this, narrative tradition and this oral history. And I grew up with it. We all did. I'm pretty sure most of us, if we weren't 60 scoopers, right? And so for me, it's, my grandmother, taught me about Nana Bijou when I was a kid. And I remember this, one of the stories she told me, I related on Facebook, a few years ago, and it was about the devil, coming to the town, dance, and dressed up as a fine white man in tailcoats, and how he took the prettiest Indian girl at the dance and took her away. And so the moral of the story is like, like beware of the white, handsome stranger because he has hooves, right? And I used to ask my grandmother to teach me that, say that story again to me again, over and over. And I was really little. And it's a cautionary tale, but then at the same time, I got criticized. Oh, well, that's post-colonial. That's not one of our traditions. And I'm like, this is a story, a bedtime story my grandmother taught me when I was a kid. And it's indigenous to me. Like it's indigenous to, my family. And so having, there are going to be naysayers who say, well, putting jingles on a vintage 1960s dress, is, not, respectful. But then I have, Lily Gladstone, wearing that beautiful dress, and she chose it because she said it was medicine. And she told, Vogue magazine that it was medicine. And this dress, must have stood out from everything that her stylist had, offered to her. And for her movie Fancy Dance, which ends in a powwow, ends at a dance, there she is wearing, elegant, gold jingles on a beautiful, vintage dress. And I'm like, good, there has to be space for modernity. There has to be
Mhm.
space for creativity. We should, reference, the past, but, have an eye to the future and the present. And I think there should be space for both.
How has the reaction been to your work in different places? Because you've exhibited all over Canada, Ontario to Quebec to Manitoba. Has there been a variance in reaction to your work in those different places?
Well, okay, so identity. I mean, we can talk about identity till the cows come home, right? And so, um, being, saying Métis at times can put a target on your back. And realistically speaking, a few years ago, I had made enough money that I could actually afford to waste money on a DNA test, and so I did. I kind of regret it, but I don't. And realistically, it has only helped me understand, that Métis people and Ojibwe people, married for the last, 100 some odd years. And my dad is, French Canadian. And so that lovely Dumont name, which is a very Métis name. And I've spent, the last decade, talking to the Dumonts out west, right? And so how I jokingly, put it, but very aptly, I'm like, French Canadian Dumont men have been loving Indigenous women for hundreds of years in our country. My dad just did it in the 1960s. And so I know I encounter, anything, sort of with a sense of humor. And realistically speaking, you kind of have to. Like when I was in Montreal and, showing with Catherine Opie and Kent Monkman, I had to find out who Catherine Opie was. Right. And I was just blown away, that I'm on the same poster as some of these most amazing artists. And I still have to pinch myself that, you know, things like this are still happening to me, because I'm a disabled, you know, northern artist, right? You know, some days I can't walk. And so I'm like, you know, the confines of my, you know, house kind of at times, right? But the thing is, I have this lovely garage, and that during the pandemic, I was able to build a mirror room, and then, you know, my back porch, my back porch became a ceramic studio, my front porch became a painting studio. And so I've really made use of my living space, and it's remarkable at how well it's being received. And that, it surprises me. Like when I get, you know, I'm not in a artsy neighborhood in Toronto. Like I was just by the transit depot, and some stranger stopped me and said, "Thank you for your artwork." And then, or on like Grindr or Scruff, I'll have like someone, you know, "Oh, I really love your artwork," blah. And I'm like, "What? How did you find me?" And so, or getting a bagel in Winnipeg, you know, or like a gluten-free, you know, breakfast muffin, a coffee, and this one young, I presume lesbian, I'm not sure, said, you know, "Oh, are you an artist? Excuse me." And I'm like, "Yes." "Oh, you've been blowing up my feed all day. I really love your artwork." And I'm like, "Oh, why, thank you." It's weird. It is so weird. But then I went to vote just last week, and the article came out with CBC and then with Indigenous TV. It went there, you know, how I decided that I couldn't, you know, abide by, you know, Donald Trump's erasure of the T in, you know, LGBT. And I was there at the beginning trying to fight for that inclusion. And I can't believe 37 years I'm still trying to do that. I was mobbed at the voting booth, and I said, you know, that I'm not a one name artist yet. And then from the back of the line, I heard, "It's Michel." I'm like, oh my God. So yeah, it's weird. It's a trip. And, it's okay. To answer this question, I'm going to do it fully. So I have these self-esteem issues, born from years of, you know, abuse. I've been sober for 26 years now. I had to go through the methadone program. You know, I've spent years, you know, trying to gleam onto a bit of health. And, God. Yeah, I know. I spent a lifetime trying to be the person that I needed when I was younger. Right. And so having that recognition that people understand that this is not a monetary gain thing, that this is just medicine. This is just me trying to find a way to deal with chronic pain, to, you know, find joy in life, and having a contemplative, you know, understanding of the world. Right. And so here I am, you know, my second runway at IFA last summer in Toronto. And, you know, I'm in so much pain. My dress arrived, like my big round crystal dress, ended up, because I packed it so badly, like a square ice cube in the wardrobe box. So I spent 2 days puffing it back out, making it round again. And I was pouring stick after stick of hot glue into two halves of the dress, hoping that Chalazon LaRue, it would not fall off her body. Right. So I'm there right to the last minute, pumping hot glue into this dress. And it goes down the runway, and I hear two kokums, you know, say, "Now that's art. That can live rent free in my head for the rest of my life."
That's incredible. That's, wow. Yeah. I'm at a loss of words for that. That's an incredible statement, and what a gift for you to hear that. You know, it's, yeah. I know you're on your phone. That should be able to activate something, but it's not. It's too bad. It'd be a great effect. So, you know, you've had some amazing career moments. You've been named the Visual Artist of the Year in Thunder Bay, residencies at the Babin Center, and a fellowship with the Leslie Lohman Museum in New York City. What has been a career highlight for you? I mean, obviously you've just mentioned something that is absolutely incredible, but from another experience. Can you reflect on something?
Okay, so I'll give you my charm offensive with the Leslie Loman Gallery in New York. All right, so starting off, like I started watching Project Runway, right? I binged watched like 14 seasons, in the first week, and I realized you could make, wearable art out of unconventional materials that you didn't necessarily need to know how to sew, even though my mother, lived by a sewing machine. My grandmother did. That's one of the reasons why, I do what I do. My mother used to make all these plastic flowers, like, Kleenex flowers and garbage bag flowers for cars, in the 1960s and 70s. And so as a kid, my sister and I, we would be making garbage bags worth of flowers to decorate, garages for weddings and, cars. And my people got married in garages, right? So, it's like, it's a big room. We can heat it, and so, I know, practical, right? And so, having that experience, and then all of a sudden, I'm now still doing the same thing. It's kind of weird, and I look at the opportunities that have been, given to me, and with the Leslie Loman, I sent them, not knowing, how to write an arts grant, not knowing how to, present yourself. I just sent them a photo to the general email of my first, packing tape dress, and said, "This is what I can do." Never got referred back. Never, no one got back to me. I'm like, who's this weird, unsolicited photo? I'm sure it just went filed bin, to the trash, pile. And so, a few years later during the pandemic, one of, the people who I had a residency, alongside, in Banff, was, commented on the chief curator, Stamatina Gregory's, comment, from the Leslie Loman. And I'm like, oh, hey, I would love to have, a studio visit, with the Leslie Loman. This is just a random comment in the comments on Instagram. And, she messaged me about a week later, emailed me, when would you like to set up a studio visit? And I was floored. But then the lockdowns, had happened, and their trips to go, to see other, artists, were all canceled. And the Leslie Loman at that time had decided that because it was, virtual, that this was the opportunity not to have the usual suspects, like the thousands of, queer artists in, the New York area, but go to the Caribbean and go to Canada, like, Two-Spirit in Indigenous Canada. And thankfully, their eye caught on my practice. I learned, the advice that I was given was invaluable. The fellowship that year that we all worked together, that we all exchanged ideas virtually online. You can't replace that. Like having a community of your peers, even online, like your podcast, is amazing. And it's what I needed, right, at that time in my life. And so, given these opportunities to educate, and it was funny, like we were, one of the lectures that we had virtually, they were talking about Marlon Briggs and Tongues Untied. And I'm like, they were talking about queer history, and I've been a devotee of queer history since I was 19. And my copy of Tongues Untied is like a VHS copy, which I got, 30 years ago. And I'm like, I got it on VHS. I'm like, do I feel old now? And so, yeah, it was wonderful to relate to all these young BIPOC, artists that could teach me something, but then I can also share perspective, right? And so, and that's the thing about these residencies, having the opportunity to hang out with these contemplative older artists, yet karaokeing and partying, albeit soberly, with the younger artists till 3:00 in the morning at Banff. It was just, I'm like, they were looking at a video at breakfast in Banff, all these older artists going, oh, look at the kids, they're all like hungover. And I'm like, I'm in that video, sitting in the corner, but I'm sober. I went straight to bed and made it for breakfast. So I love being this middle-aged. It's kind of cool, although it's, I'm getting older each minute.
So, I love how your work is with found and upcycled material. How do you decide what to use in your pieces?
Oh my goodness. Okay, so really what people gift me, right? And so like for buttons, it was a friend's mother who was, preparing for, passing away, and no one in her family wanted her lifetime collection of buttons. And so she knew I would do something with it. She gifted them to me. She got to see my first project that I did with buttons, which tell a story, and it's the materiality, which is kind of important, right? And for example, pill bottles. I've been collecting pill bottles for the last, almost 3 years now from across the country. People started mailing me boxes of their pill bottles. I got like a big box from a collective of 9 to 12 disabled artists from, Halifax. I've gotten, pill bottles from, the United States, from coast to coast to coast. So from Iqaluit, up in the north in Baffin Island to, Victoria to Halifax, from sea to sea to sea in Canada, and then now in the United States. And that materiality, each of these pill bottles tell a story. My own, medication journey as a disabled, artist is complicated. Right. I was one of the first people to put on oxycodone, in Thunder Bay. There was only like one pharmacy in town that actually had it. And then I got to see the whole world get addicted to it. And so that has given me perspective. And being an artist has afforded me the honesty and the ability to be brutally honest about my own history. And I think people see themselves reflected in my artwork, and that gives it power. The stories that people sent me, the letters that they sent me, with their medication bottles, and the fact that they placed their trust in me, I'm deeply honored, and I can't thank them enough. When I think about opiates and in our communities, how it's devastated our communities, I can't help but think that I have to try to do something meaningful, and, show something that, needs closer examination, because we need medications to survive. Right. And that's the thing. I'm inspired by Nan Golding. And the thing is, if you're inspired by the best and, you put it through your own lens, that can be a powerful thing. Right. And so, yeah, I steal from the best. Like my mirror room, Yeo Kasama. Right. But those mirrors were $5 a mirror from an old department store called Eaton's. And they'd been there for 20 years at the Eaton's department store on the second floor. And I sifted through hundreds of broken mirrors to find 13 or so that were in perfect shape to, put in a mirror room in my garage. And so, I'm if it's cheap or free, that's a good, especially I'm on disability. I'm on this government pension, like Ontario Disability Support Plan. I make like $1,400 a month. And so my rent is like $1,400. And so it's remarkable what I've been able to achieve, coming from a place of poverty and, accommodation, like asking galleries to accommodate, to, fly me, to a show. I'm asking them to, really understand my perspective, and I'm only being welcomed. And that is quite something.
So what's next for you? What exciting projects do you have coming up? What's on the horizon for you?
Oh, my projects. And I have to be really wary about, certain things. Like I recently spoke about a Banff art residency, which did not happen. I did not, get invited. And then last year I was put on a wait list for Banff. And, I lost 30 pounds. I started exercising because I'm like, okay, I'm getting all these opportunities. And, at the age of 57, I've got to bring my A game, right? And then at the same time, they can, evaporate. And so I have to be really concrete and saying, okay, so the Leslie Loman has asked for my Nimbus of Alienation, my pill bottle cloud, to show at the Leslie Loman this fall, or this gallery year coming. Now, the thing is, some of those things change, right? Like, for example, when I decided that I proposed this idea, like of having, pill bottles, sort of like an exploded kaleidoscope in the air, hanging by monofilament, fishing line. It was, they said, okay, let's postpone it by a year because you'll have the center room. It's not going to be on the, periphery of the gallery. And so, yeah, like, I mean, places have been, pulled back. Like I was supposed to like project an image in Winnipeg, and then one of the second lockdown happened. And so there's like lovely CBC articles of things that never happened. And I'm like, but it's not my fault. The world changed. And so now it's like, I know I'm really optimistic, and I'm like, oh, well, like there's supposed to be a show that may be going to Europe. However, not sure yet. I know that my crystal dress and the Lily Gladstone dress may actually go to, a museum, for, display. Which museum, they're in negotiations, like there's negotiations with the Victoria and Albert Museum in, England, and et cetera. And so it's like, what can I talk about, without putting my foot in my mouth and saying, you need to edit that because that didn't happen.
Yeah. I heard the story about her dresses going to museums, so that's really exciting to hear. That's still happening. Of course, you can't predict how these things are going to land, though. So I can understand that. Indigenous futurism is a growing movement. How do you see your work contributing to the conversations about the future of Indigenous arts?
What I think is fascinating is that, being included in, comprehensive shows that have a history, that show, where we've been, where we are, and where we're going. And I think because of my unconventional materials, that I'm where we're going. And at the same time, honoring that materiality and honoring the stories that I'm bringing to, the materials. Like, for me, dealing with reflectivity is also dealing with ice, and the frozen, lakes of, growing up as a kid, right? There are, how even making like an artificial leather, like sort of like a vegan leather, right? Like it is, and then, translating, using different, things to translate, ideas that are rooted in the past and or the present. So futurism, I think, is fascinating. At the same time, I'm a contemporary human being who lives in this world, and the dollar store is something I can afford, right? And so trying to spin, gold out of straw, really, it allows me to tell a story. And that story we've been telling for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? And so I'm just, grateful that, people want to like, play Mr. Dress Up, at my house. And, I have this sort of, the House of Dumont is sort of like this rainbow collective of people who like hang out for barbecues, in my backyard. And then we have art builds and we watch, movies like Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. And it's weird. I have this rainbow hippie household, and I'm like, of course I do. Of course I have an open door. Of course the people can sleep on my couch. They've been doing that for years, right? And so, it's, I'm living the life that I want, and with uncompromised and not really burdened by, commerce. And at the same time, this old socialist, I know I need money to live. And And so I know now I have gallery representation with the Paul Petro Gallery in Toronto. I should have plugged him earlier. He's taking a risk. He's taking a risk on me, but at the same time, he's helping propel me, to like the Gardner Museum for my ceramics. And he's getting the word out there that, I exist. And realistically, like I did my regalia bear, my Every Child Matters bear during the pandemic. I spent 2 years hand carving regalia that if I had the nerve, if I didn't have nerve damage, I would have, did traditionally with a needle and thread. But because I have, an upper back injury, I have a lot of, fine motor loss. And so that one piece, went viral. I put a video up and I got COVID, right? And so I put a video up, slept for a week, woke up, and boom, it had like 18,000, views or so on TikTok. That was like the third video I ever put up on TikTok. And I'm like, I woke up from my fever and I'm like, oh shit, people saw the beauty in what I do. And I mean, that's its own reward. Right? The fact that there was reaction videos, and I'm like, what's a reaction video? And so, yeah, I mean, the internet, has sort of changed my life, right? I'm going to AA meetings online, right? Like the activism that I needed, in my early 30s, wouldn't have happened, without, the internet. And so, I'm really just amazed that, that people want to hang out with someone my age.
If you could give a piece of advice to an emerging Two-Spirit or Indigenous artist, what would that be?
Love this question because I just heard you ask it on another interview. All right. So the thing is, some of the youngest artists I've ever met can be technically really proficient, but they need perspective and they need experience. And so one of your lovely interviewers said, keep making, keep working, even if it's just for yourself. For me, I made candles for like 10, 15 years. And my friends would come over and I would fire up the double boiler hot, wax, and we would make candles. And it was something just for the joy of it, right? And discovering the joy of whatever you want to do in your art practice, validation, can come later in life. Get proficient at what you're doing, have joy in it, enjoy doing it, sharing it freely, finding love, in that materiality and, enjoying what you do. Learn how to share it with the world, and if the world wants it, it'll happen, right? Don't, like, if you want to give yourself a timeline, this is going to happen in 5 years, that could set you up to fail, right? If you're just painting on your front lawn and, people, come by and, dog walkers say, what are you doing? And they like what you're doing. That in itself, it's its own reward, right? It's, flexing your own little art muscles and enjoying it. And that's where you need to seek the validation and your personal, love of it. And so for a lot of, younger artists, I'm always like, I'm always a cheerleader. And I name drop badly. I'm like, I'll name drop, all these, other artists as well. It's like the big ones and, the up and, coming emerging artists, right? Because I'm just, a fan of, people expressing themselves and actualizing themselves, right? It's like, yes, show me your artwork, show me the joy that lives within.
Michel, thank you so much for this powerful conversation. This has been wonderful. Thank you for sharing your journey, your artistry, and your voice with us.
Miigwech, big thank you.
Thank you for joining us on this journey through Indigenous art and creativity. Stay inspired and keep exploring with us on Beyond the Art.
Remember to subscribe and follow us for more exclusive interviews, insightful discussions, and stories that ignite your artistic imagination.
Until next time, continue to unlock your limitless potential with Beyond the Art. Thank you for listening.